The world rarely paid attention to Eleanor Marsh. She moved like a shadow among the high shelves of the university archives, her voice a murmur that hardly reached beyond the dust-coated tomes she cared for. To the scholars who breezed past her desk, she was just the librarian, a quiet custodian of forgotten manuscripts. But on that late autumn evening, when a brittle scroll cracked open in her trembling hands, destiny shifted its gaze. She saw what no one else had, the faint whispers of ink that refused to fade completely. The celebrated Egyptologist, Dr. Adrian Vale, had tossed the parchment into the irrelevant pile months ago. Water damage, he had pronounced with a lazy wave of his hand, dismissing it as nothing more than ruined fibers. His students laughed, scribbling notes about hopeless junk. To him, the archive was a stage where his brilliance shone brightest, while Eleanor was little more than scenery in the background. What he never noticed was the way she lingered, her eyes scanning every line, as if the manuscripts themselves confided in her. That night, under the glow of a desk lamp, Eleanor's heart pounded. She traced the faint lines irregular, almost invisible. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but as she angled the scroll toward the light, the strokes revealed themselves. Not stains, but symbols. Hieratic script, she realized, woven cleverly among what appeared to be water blotches. Her breath caught. These marks weren't random. They formed patterns. They formed a message. Why would anyone hide words in stains, she wondered, her mind racing. And then, as if answering her, an old memory surfaced. She remembered her grandfather, an eccentric historian who died ridiculed for his obsession with the invisible ink of antiquity. He had once whispered to her, "The ancients left their secrets for those patient enough to see them." Eleanor had dismissed it as a child's bedtime story. But here, decades later, his words echoed in her bones. Fear and excitement tangled in her chest. She copied the strange symbols into her notebook, her hand trembling. The marks suggested directionality, an arrow-like sequence, pointing to a location, a name. She could barely make sense of it, but one word was unmistakable. It was repeated 3 times, bold against the decay of centuries. Nfr-ka-Ra. The name sent a shiver down her spine. She scoured her mental catalog of pharaohs. There was no record of such a ruler, yet the word carried all the structure of a royal title. Could this scroll be pointing to a forgotten king, one erased from the annals of Egypt? Across campus, Dr. Vale sipped brandy in the lounge, boasting about his latest publication on Cleopatra's jewelry. "History rewards confidence," he declared to a circle of admirers. He had no idea that a humble librarian was unraveling a mystery that would dwarf every one of his so-called breakthroughs. Eleanor pressed her palm against the parchment, whispering to herself, "You were meant to be found." For years, she had been invisible, dismissed, patronized. But at that moment, staring at the coded script, she felt the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. If her discovery was real, it could change everything: the university, her reputation, and the understanding of Egypt itself. Her rational mind urged caution. Perhaps I'm seeing what I want to see. Perhaps I'm desperate to matter. Yet her heart thundered with conviction. Every fiber of her being told her this scroll was no accident. Someone, centuries ago, had hidden it for a reason. And she, Eleanor Marsh, was chosen to find it. The clock on the wall struck midnight. The library was empty but for her steady breath and the scroll's silent whisper. She closed her notebook, tucking the faded copy into her satchel. She would not show Dr. Vale. Not yet. Not until she knew more. The memory of his mocking tone still burned. "Stick to shelving books, Eleanor. Leave the discoveries to us." She straightened her back. This time, she would not be silenced. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Dr. Adrian Vale's life. The lamplight flickered as she carried the scroll into the shadows of the archive. Beyond those walls, A forgotten king waited, buried beneath centuries of sand. And Eleanor Marsh, the librarian no one noticed, had just taken the first step toward awakening him. Eleanor's satchel weighed heavier than usual, though inside it was nothing more than paper and ink. The walk home from the archive was only 15 minutes. But tonight every street lamp seemed like an interrogation light. Every echo of her shoes, a reminder that she was carrying a secret no one else suspected. She shut her door quickly behind her, locked it twice, and laid the notebook on her small kitchen table. The faded symbols stared back at her, stubborn, demanding to be understood. She cleared her throat, whispering, as if afraid the walls might listen, "These are coordinates. They have to be." It wasn't a baseless guess. She had spent half her life cataloging ancient maps, her brain quietly absorbing knowledge she never thought would matter. Lines that seemed random to anyone else fell into rhythm for her. There was repetition in the script, numbers disguised as symbols. She began sketching them across a grid, each mark aligning to what looked like latitude and longitude. At first, the figures led nowhere. She tried again, this time adjusting for how Egyptians sometimes mirrored their writing. The numbers shifted, bent into possibility, and at last they settled near a known stretch of desert not far from Luxor. Eleanor's chest tightened. Luxor, the land of countless tombs, but still holding mysteries beneath its sands. Could the scroll be pointing to one that had eluded centuries of excavation? Her mind swirled with doubt. No one believes in things like this. Not anymore. They'll laugh me out of the archives. She pressed her hands to her face, remembering the way Dr. Vale sneered when she once suggested a papyrus fragment in the basement might belong to the Middle Kingdom instead of the late period. "Stick to your cataloging, Miss Marsh," he had said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Leave the real scholarship to real scholars." Yet, that fragment had later been confirmed by another researcher to be exactly what she had claimed. The memory fueled her fire now. If she had been right once, she could be right again. Her fingers brushed over a faded corner of the scroll she had photographed. There, hidden in the shadows of the text, was a cartouche. Inside it, the repeated name, Nfr-ka-Ra. She whispered it aloud, and the sound felt foreign, forbidden. There was no record of this pharaoh, no mention in any of the king lists she had memorized. Whoever he was, history had erased him thoroughly. But why? The thought gnawed at her. Pharaohs erased from history often carried scandals, failed reigns, curses, or betrayals that powerful successors wanted forgotten. What if this was one of them? And what if his tomb remained untouched, buried, concealed, protected by secrecy rather than stone? The clock struck 1 in the morning. Eleanor pushed her tea aside, eyes aching but unwilling to close. She pulled down her grandfather's old dictionary of Middle Egyptian and began cross-referencing the symbols. With each translation, the scroll revealed more. Not just coordinates, but warnings. The sun will hide it. The winds will guard it. Only the patient may enter. Her heart skipped. These weren't just poetic phrases. They were riddles, clues for reaching the tomb itself. She remembered her grandfather again, his eccentric insistence that ancient scribes hid keys within their words. At the time she thought he was rambling, but now those ramblings became her compass. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. In the silence her thoughts whispered like accusations. "You're a librarian, not an explorer. What can you possibly do with this? Even if you're right, what then? Who will listen to you?" But beneath the fear, another voice emerged. Steadier, braver. "This is yours. You saw what others could not. You cannot hand it over, not yet." By dawn, her decision was made. She would keep decoding the scroll in secret. She would gather enough evidence before revealing it to anyone. Not Dr. Vale, not the professors, not even the department chair who smiled kindly but never took her seriously. As the sun's first light spilled across her kitchen, Eleanor traced the last line she had translated. It ended with a symbol for door, followed by eternity. She whispered, "A door to eternity." The words rolled like thunder inside her. Somewhere beneath the Egyptian sands, such a door waited for her hand to open it. She closed her notebook, pressing it to her chest as though it were a shield. Already, she knew this discovery would demand everything of her, her courage, her reputation, perhaps even her safety. But she could not walk away. The fated symbols had chosen her. The next evening, Eleanor returned to the archives, her heart racing with anticipation and fear. She moved quietly among the stacks, like she had 100 times before. But tonight her purpose was no longer shelving forgotten manuscripts. Tonight she hunted for whispers, for fragments of truth that had eluded everyone else. Her hands, practiced and steady, reached for a box labeled Miscellaneous Papyri, Unclassified. She had seen the box before, passed it countless times, always dismissed by scholars as unimportant scraps. But now, with the strange name Nfr-ka-Ra echoing in her mind, she believed the box might hide more than dust. She sifted through brittle fragments, coughing at the burst of ancient powder that clung to her fingers. Most were routine: inventories, receipts, prayers written in hurried script. But then, tucked between two blank pieces, she found something unusual: a torn edge of papyrus bearing a half cartouche. Her pulse quickened. It contained 3 familiar symbols, the same as those on the scroll. Her breath came shallow. She carefully compared the fragment to her notes. The symbols matched perfectly. But here, in this smaller piece, was something more. A phrase: "The king whom the gods erased." Eleanor felt the weight of those words slam against her chest. A pharaoh deliberately erased from history. It confirmed her suspicion. Whoever Nfr-ka-Ra was, he had been condemned to oblivion, cast out of Egypt's proud lineage. But the more they tried to erase him, the more his shadow lingered in forgotten corners, waiting for someone willing to look. Her mind whirled with questions. Who was he? Why had his memory been destroyed? And why had his tomb been hidden with such secrecy? The thought chilled her. Some secrets were buried, not to protect them, but to protect the world from them. A sudden sound jolted her, the echo of shoes across marble floors. Eleanor froze, clutching the fragment. She peered over the shelves and saw the unmistakable figure of Dr. Adrian Vale, strolling in with 2 of his graduate students. His voice carried, booming with arrogance. "Students, let this be a lesson. 90% of what you find in these archives is garbage. The other 10% belongs to those of us who know how to interpret it, not the underlings." His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly when he noticed Eleanor standing there. A smirk tugged at his lips. "Still haunting the dust, Miss Marsh?" She bit back a retort, sliding the fragment into her pocket before he could notice. "Somebody has to care for what you call garbage," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Vale chuckled, turning back to his students. "And that is why she's a librarian, not a historian. Remember, interpretation is everything." His words stung, but inside, Eleanor felt something shift. The ridicule no longer crushed her, it fueled her. For years she had been the quiet shadow, tolerating his condescension. But now, with the scroll and the fragment in her possession, she held knowledge Vale could not dream of. As they left, her fists unclenched. She pulled the fragment back out, holding it up to the lamp. The king whom the gods erased. A forbidden pharaoh, a hidden scroll, and now, proof that his story was real. Her grandfather's voice whispered again in her memory. History does not destroy what is meant to be found. It only hides it until the right eyes come along. She traced the fragment with trembling fingers, and an image flashed across her mind: the vast desert, golden sands, stretching endlessly, hiding beneath them a tomb that had never seen the touch of grave robbers or archaeologists. A place where eternity itself was sealed away. Her lips formed a vow in the stillness of the archive. "I will find you, and I will bring your story back." What she didn't know was that her vow had just lit the first spark of a fire that would consume everything She knew her safety, her reputation, even her trust in those closest to her. The university's grand hall shimmered with chandeliers and polished marble, a stage where scholars performed their brilliance before an eager audience. Tonight's lecture, The Last Mysteries of Egypt, belonged to none other than Dr. Adrian Vale. He stood at the podium in a tailored suit, his voice a booming command that filled the vaulted ceiling. Students scribbled notes, colleagues nodded sagely, and donors leaned forward, enthralled. Eleanor sat at the back, her notebook clutched against her chest. She hadn't planned to attend, but whispers of Vale's lecture had drifted through the archive, and curiosity had tugged her here. Perhaps, deep down, she wanted to hear if the man who mocked her had even the faintest inkling of the truth she carried in her satchel. Vale flourished a slide of Cleopatra's diadem. "The crown jewels of Egypt," he declared, "remind us that history has no more great secrets. We, the scholars, have already unveiled its mysteries." The hall echoed with polite laughter. Eleanor's hands tightened. Her eyes darted to her own notes. The fragment, the scroll, the repeated name of Nfr-ka-Ra. She felt the weight of contradiction pressing between his words and her truth. During the Q&A, a young student hesitantly asked, "Professor, what about rumors of erased pharaohs? Could there be more rulers we don't yet know?" Vale chuckled, a theatrical wave dismissing the idea. "Conspiracy theories. Amateurs cling to shadows, hoping to find relevance in nonsense. Egypt's king list is complete. Anyone claiming otherwise is either a fool or a dreamer." The words stabbed at Eleanor. She could almost feel every eye in the hall flicker toward her, though she sat silent, invisible in the back row. Her chest burned with the memory of his smirk in the archives. His words, "Stick to shelving books." Her inner voice whispered, "Speak, stand, show them." Her heart pounded. She raised her hands slowly. The hall turned, surprised to see the quiet librarian break her silence. Vale's smile faltered, then curved again, amused. "Yes, Miss Marsh?" Her voice trembled, but did not break. "What if the scrolls we dismiss as damaged hold more than stains? What if hidden symbols point to a pharaoh who was deliberately erased?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Vale's eyebrows arched high. "Ah, our librarian entertains us with fairy tales," he said smoothly, eliciting laughter from the crowd. "And who is this mythical pharaoh, Miss Marsh? King Nobody of Nowhere?" Her cheeks flushed crimson, but she lifted her chin. "Nfr-ka-Ra." The hall stilled. A hush spread, as if the name itself carried weight. Even Vale faltered for half a second before regaining composure. He laughed, louder this time. "Invented gibberish. No such king exists. I assure you, if he had, I would have found him long before a librarian stumbled across his name." The arrogance in his tone struck harder than the laughter that followed. Yet, beneath the humiliation, something inside Eleanor crystallized. The sting of his scorn no longer bent her spirit, it sharpened it. His dismissal was not proof she was wrong, but proof she was onto something too threatening for him to entertain. She lowered her hand, her face calm, though her heart raged. Inwardly, she whispered to herself, "I will prove you wrong. Not for your approval, but so history remembers who you failed to see." The Q&A moved on, Vale basking once more in his own performance. But Eleanor's mind was already elsewhere. The fragments, the scroll, the coordinates pointing to Luxor, they called to her louder than any jeering laughter. When the lecture ended, she slipped quietly out of the hall, unnoticed again. But this time invisibility worked in her favor. In her satchel lay the truth, Vale mocked. In her heart burned the determination he could never extinguish. For Eleanor Marsh, the librarian no one took seriously, tonight was no defeat. It was ignition. The desert stretched before Eleanor like an endless sea of gold, the horizon wavering under the merciless sun. She stood at the edge of the sands near Luxor, clutching her worn satchel and shielding her eyes. For the first time in her life, she was far from the comfort of archives and ink, standing instead where history itself slept beneath shifting dunes. The journey here had been reckless, even mad by her own measure. She had pawned her grandmother's ring for the flight, borrowed a tent from a sympathetic student, and told no one, especially not Vale, where she was going. If I fail, no one will know. If I succeed, the world will. That mantra had kept her steady as the plane touched down in Cairo, and as she boarded a bus, rattling south through villages lined with palms. Now, as she stepped into the sand, doubt clawed at her. You are a librarian, not an explorer. What if the scroll was wrong? What if Vale was right? She squeezed the notebook tighter. Her translations glared back at her. The sun will hide it. The winds will guard it. Only the patient may enter. The desert wind howled as if mocking her. She walked anyway. By evening, Eleanor pitched her small tent near a cluster of crumbling ruins. Villagers had warned her that this stretch of desert was cursed, avoided even by seasoned guides. She told them she was studying inscriptions. It wasn't entirely a lie. Still, their eyes followed her with unease, as though they knew she was treading where mortals should not. That night, she spread her notebook on the sand and aligned her compass to the stars. The coordinates etched in the faded scroll pointed not to any known excavation site, but to a barren stretch marked only by dunes. Yet, when she overlaid the symbols onto the ancient star maps she had memorized, they aligned with uncanny precision. The ancients had hidden their directions not on land, but in the heavens. She whispered to the night, "It's here. You're here." A pang of loneliness struck her. She remembered the lecture hall, Vale's laughter, the audience's smirks. She imagined their faces if they could see her now alone, sweating, determined, daring to believe in a forgotten king. She thought of her grandfather again, how he had died, ridiculed for believing in invisible ink. Tears burned her eyes. "I will finish what you began, grandfather. I'll prove you weren't mad. You were right." The following morning, Eleanor rose before dawn. The desert air was cool, the sky still pale. She hiked toward the coordinates, her feet sinking into soft sand, her breath ragged. Hours passed, but then there, a jagged rise, half buried beneath the dune, caught the edge of sunlight. To any passerby, it looked like a rock. But Eleanor's eyes, sharpened by years of cataloging unnoticed details, recognized its shape immediately. A carved block, its edges too straight for nature. Her knees buckled. She scrambled toward it, brushing away sand with frantic hands. Carved into the stone was a faint symbol, the same cartouche she had traced in her notebook. Nfr-ka-Ra. Her heart thundered. She had found it. But her triumph was tempered by fear. What lay beneath had been hidden for millennia. Was it hidden to be protected, or to protect the world from what it contained? The words from the fragment returned to her. The king, whom the gods erased. Eleanor sat back on her heels, staring at the half-buried block. The desert wind screamed around her, flinging sand against her skin, as if urging her to turn back. Yet deep inside, her resolve only solidified. She had come this far, endured mockery, risked everything. She could not leave now. She whispered into the rising sun, her voice trembling but resolute. "I will uncover your story. Even if the world has forgotten you, I will not." And with that vow, Eleanor Marsh began to dig. The desert had no mercy. Hours bled into days as Eleanor clawed at the shifting dunes with her bare hands. Then, with a battered trowel she had borrowed from the ruins nearby, sand filled her shoes, her throat, her dreams. Yet still she dug, her satchel never far from reach, the scroll's whispers guiding her every motion. By the third day, the carved block she had uncovered had grown into a pattern, an outline. What she thought was a lone stone revealed itself as part of a larger formation, a structure swallowed whole by time. On the fourth evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she brushed away a slab and gasped. Beneath it was a seam, too precise to be natural, the faint curve of a sealed doorway. Her hands trembled. The inscriptions on the lintel had nearly vanished under the sand's relentless assault, but her eyes, trained on fragments and shadows, deciphered them with clarity. The cartouche repeated, Nfr-ka-Ra. Below it, a warning. The door to eternity opens only to the patient. Eleanor staggered back, her breath ragged. The words from the scroll, the warnings in the fragment, they converged here. The door was real. That night she lit a small lantern, shielding its flame from the desert wind. Sitting cross-legged before the buried doorway, she let the fire's glow lick across the hieroglyphs. She read them aloud softly, her voice quivering. He who defied the gods shall rest unseen. He who enters without reverence shall never leave. The air seemed to thicken. The hairs on her arms rose. She closed her notebook, hugging it tightly. Fear pressed against her, whispering that this was the point to turn back, that she had proven enough already, that going further could cost her everything. But then another whisper surfaced, her grandfather's voice. The ancients left their secrets for those patient enough to see them. Tears pricked her eyes. She answered him aloud, And I have seen. At dawn, Eleanor set to work clearing the entrance. She carved a trench around the lintel, pulling stones aside until the outline of a doorway stood clear. Exhaustion burned in her bones, but her heart pounded with exhilaration. She leaned against the cool surface of the sealed stone, her cheek pressed to history itself. Then, with a final push, the stone slab shifted. A gust of ancient air hissed past her face, dry and bitter as the desert itself. The smell of centuries' stale dust, decay, and something metallic poured into her lungs. She coughed, staggering back, staring at the dark passage yawning before her. Her lantern flickered as she lifted it high. Shadows stretched into the narrow corridor beyond, walls etched with faint carvings. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't a mirage. It wasn't a dream. She had opened the tomb. For a moment, awe anchored her to the spot. She thought of Vale preening in lecture halls, declaring history finished. She thought of the students who laughed, the donors who applauded, the professors who barely noticed her name. None of them were here. None of them had touched what she now touched. But with awe came dread. The inscriptions were not mere flourishes, they were warnings. He who enters without reverence shall never leave. Eleanor swallowed hard, the desert silent around her. Her inner voice whispered, This could be the greatest discovery of your age, or your grave. Still, she stepped forward. The sand crunched beneath her boots. As she crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, heavier, pressing against her skin. For the first time, the quiet librarian, who had spent her life among forgotten shelves, felt the magnitude of history tilt toward her. The door had opened, and the tomb was awake. The lantern flame wavered, painting the narrow passage in trembling gold. Eleanor's breath clouded the still air, each exhale breaking centuries of silence. The walls on either side pressed close, carved with shallow reliefs almost erased by time. Her fingers brushed the grooves, tracing the images of priests kneeling before a figure whose face had been chiseled away. The erasure was deliberate. This was the king whom the gods or men had condemned to be forgotten. She whispered, Nfr-ka-Ra. The name echoed down the stone corridor like a forbidden prayer. The passage twisted downward, sand crunched under her boots, and the stale air thickened, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of something long sealed. Eleanor's heart thudded louder than her footsteps. She should have been terrified, and she was but woven into her fear was exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she was not cataloging someone else's discovery. She was living her own. Her lantern illuminated a small chamber ahead. She stepped inside, gasping as light revealed its walls. Painted scenes sprawled across the stone. Battles, coronations, rituals, yet every image had been violently defaced. Faces gouged out, names hacked into oblivion. Only one cartouche remained untouched, repeated again and again like a curse. Nfr-ka-Ra. The sight chilled her. Why erase everything but the name? She murmured. Her mind raced. Perhaps the Pharaoh's memory had been condemned, yet his name was forced to endure as a warning, a mark not of honor, but of infamy. At the center of the chamber, lay a stone altar. On it rested a clay jar sealed with pitch, its surface painted with protective symbols. Eleanor bent close, lantern light glinting off the jar's cracked glaze. Her hand hovered over it, trembling. Every instinct told her not to touch it, but she had come too far to stop. She lifted the jar. The seal crumbled at her touch, brittle from centuries of waiting. Inside was a roll of papyrus, astonishingly preserved. She unwrapped it carefully, her breath hitching as she read the first lines. It was a confession. The script, written by a scribe's hand, told of a king who defied the gods, who waged war not just against nations but against temples themselves. He had ordered idols destroyed, priests executed, their voices silenced forever. His enemies cursed his memory, his successors obliterated his image, and yet his tomb had been built in secret, sealed away from the world. Eleanor's eyes blurred with the weight of what she was reading. This was more than history. This was the forbidden truth. A pharaoh deliberately erased because he had turned his kingdom against its own gods. Her hands shook as she realized what this meant. She had uncovered the only surviving record of his existence. Her discovery would rewrite Egypt's history, topple the certainty of the scholars who mocked her. But before she could revel in triumph, the chamber itself seemed to resist her presence. The lantern flickered violently. The floor creaked as sand shifted beneath the stones. She stumbled back, clutching the papyrus to her chest. Her inner voice screamed, "Leave now. Leave while you can." But she couldn't. She was torn between survival and destiny. She pushed deeper into the chamber. Beyond the altar, another doorway loomed. Hieroglyphs lined its frame, painted in red ochre that had not faded. She translated them with a dry throat. "He who opens this door shall awaken the eternal king." The hairs on her arms rose. Her knees quivered, yet she stepped closer. With trembling hands, she pushed. The stone door groaned, ancient mechanisms grinding as sand poured in rivulets at her feet. Slowly, the darkness parted. Inside, her lantern revealed a vast burial hall, pillars carved with serpents, golden offerings scattered like stars across the floor, and at the center, a sarcophagus of black basalt, its surface gleaming with inlaid copper. The lid bore no face, only the name repeated like a heartbeat: Nfr-ka-Ra. Eleanor staggered forward, tears stinging her eyes. She had done it. She had found the lost tomb of the erased pharaoh. And as her lantern flame flared against the basalt lid, she whispered, trembling with awe and terror, "History will never erase you again." The tomb seemed to breathe in answer. The days after her discovery blurred into one long, surreal haze. Eleanor's tent became both sanctuary and prison. Its thin walls the only barrier between her and the storm of consequences she knew would follow. She spent hours copying the inscriptions, photographing the walls, and carefully sealing the papyrus confession she had found. Each moment felt borrowed, as if the desert itself could reclaim the tomb at any second. She stood at the threshold often, staring back into the burial hall. The basalt sarcophagus dominated the chamber, its silence heavy, its name carved like a drumbeat of defiance: Nfr-ka-Ra. She dared not open it. To disturb the king's rest felt like crossing a line her soul could not return from. She had found his story, that was enough. Still, she lingered, whispering to the shadows, "I see you. I remember you." It was her way of granting dignity to the man condemned by history, not as a ruler she admired, but as a truth the world deserved to know. Weeks later, Eleanor returned to the university, sunburned, exhausted, but with fire in her eyes. She walked through the same grand hall where Dr. Vale had once mocked her. Only this time, she carried proof fragments, photographs, translations that could not be dismissed as fantasies. The unveiling was not gentle. Vale, red-faced and sputtering, tried to discredit her findings. "Forgery, coincidence. She lacks credentials." His words echoed hollowly as Eleanor laid each artifact on the table, each photograph of the tomb, each line of translation. The audience leaned forward, breathless. For once, the quiet librarian commanded the room. And then came the breaking point. Eleanor unrolled the preserved papyrus, her voice steady as she read aloud. The king whom the gods erased, for he defied them. Gasps rippled across the hall. The words, spoken after 3,000 years, silenced every doubt. Vale staggered, his confidence crumbling. He had built his career on declaring history complete, only to be undone by the woman he had ridiculed. For the first time, Eleanor saw fear in his eyes, not of her, but of irrelevance. He knew the truth as well as she did. The discovery belonged to her, and the world would remember her name. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's life transformed. Scholars from across the globe reached out. Journals clamored for her story. Students whispered her name with reverence instead of laughter. She had stepped out of the shadows, not by demanding recognition, but by following the quiet conviction that the overlooked details mattered. Yet, amid the accolades, she returned often in her thoughts to the tomb. In her dreams, she walked again down the narrow passage, lantern flickering, hearing the silence breathe around her. She never dreamed of gold or acclaim, only of the nameless faces gouged from the walls, the warnings etched in red. The Pharaoh was remembered again, but not glorified. His story stood as both revelation and warning. On a quiet evening, Eleanor sat alone in the archive where it had all begun. The same scroll, once dismissed as water damage, now lay carefully preserved under glass. She touched the case lightly, whispering, "You were meant to be found." Her gaze drifted to the shelves. Around her rows upon rows of forgotten manuscripts, each waiting for someone patient enough to see. She smiled softly, knowing her grandfather would have been proud. History had not rewarded arrogance or titles. It had rewarded humility, patience, and the courage to listen to what others ignored. Eleanor Marsh, once the invisible librarian, had proven that truth doesn't need permission to be seen. It only needs eyes willing to look. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph. And with that, the tale of the erased Pharaoh, the librarian, and the tomb hidden by gods closed with its final lesson: humility sees what pride blinds.